Cindy. In 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You're on.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Maine Public's All Books Considered Book Club. I'm Cindy Hahn, and I'm so happy today to be hosting this conversation with Gregory Brown, the author of The Lowering Days. Hi, Greg.
Hey,
But
Cindy.
first, I just want to thank our sponsors, Birch Brook and Bull Moose, for supporting the book club all this past year. And I also want to thank our bookstore partners, who have, many of you have gone to these bookstores to get your book and get your copy of The Lowering Days. So I wanted to thank Bookstacks, Left Bank Books, Print, Sherman's Maine Coast Bookshops, DDG Booksellers, and Bull Moose. So let's get started and welcome Gregory Brown. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll do a quick introduction. Greg grew up in Maine, right here in Maine along the Penobscot Bay. He studied at the Iowa Writers Workshop. He's had many of his works published and has gotten some top scholarships and fellowships over the years. And he now lives in Casco with his family and 5 dogs. Is that right, Greg? Lots of dogs. And The Lowering Days is his debut novel. So congratulations, Greg.
Thank you, Cindy. Yeah, and thanks for having me here.
Sure. And it's interesting that this is your debut novel because you've been writing for a while. And so my first question before we get to some of these great questions from our book club members, I'm just wondering, you must have been thinking of a lot of different themes over all these years. So how did you come upon what you wanted this book to be about and what you wanted to include in this novel?
Yeah, one of my teachers out at Iowa, Marilyn Robinson, she would often talk about paying attention or honoring the landscape of your preoccupations. And I always loved that phrase, and it's a phrase that I brought into my own teaching quite often. And what I noticed, like when I started writing fiction, I was a short story writer. That's what I was most drawn to form-wise. That was kind of my preoccupation. But I had this set of characters, particularly this family that became one of the families at the heart of the Lowering Days, that was just kind of with me in the background for many years. And I also had an image of this house set apart on a peninsula in a river, and just the very like kind of aliveness of the world all around it, and how the lives of the family and the lives of the land started to interact. So for years, like these things were kind of percolating in the background. Then I finally realized that, oh, this is a novel, and it's a lot bigger than I realized, and I need to fully devote myself to exploring it. So I moved away from short stories and put all my effort into The Lowering Days, and over time it just expanded and grew more and more layers.
Well, it's clearly something you know well, either because it's been living in your head or
Yeah.
because you actually did grow up in that kind of part of Maine. And so is a lot of this autobiographical, or the descriptions are from your childhood?
It's funny, like very little of the book is autobiographical. Like I have a sister who's wonderful, and I don't have 3 brothers, and my mom didn't run a newspaper, and my dad didn't serve in Vietnam. But what's very autobiographical is this kind of feeling of the land, of the geography, of kind of the tensions that ran through and run through small communities that I felt as a child growing up in Maine, and just kind of the wonder of this very, very special place that we all live in. So there were kind of like sensibilities and sensations that feel really autobiographical, but the events of the book are totally, for the most part, acts of invention. One of the things that's most autobiographical, I guess, is the house that Molly and Adam ultimately kind of hide out in. My uncle owned an old house on Route 1 outside of Searsport. It's kind of this dilapidated, falling down house. And at one point, the running joke in the family was that it was like the most photographed eyesore in all of the state of Maine, because people would flock there to take pictures of this old ramshackle sea captain's house. So there's a lot of little images like that from my childhood, little kind of places or echoes of places that have come into the book. And those are autobiographical. And I think that's interesting, because a lot of the best autobiographical fiction, it doesn't necessarily draw on the events of people's lives as much as it does like the emotional events and the qualities of various moments in their lives. At least I feel.
Well, great. And I'm curious too, what your process is. How do you go about writing a book like this with all these themes interconnected and all these stories interconnected? How do you map it out, and where do you write, and how does that all work?
Yeah, it's a nightmare sometimes. It's a process of going very slowly. For me, I struggle, or I've always struggled to outline anything too thoroughly, because then I kind of lose my interest, or the wonder of it disappears. Like, once you know what is going to happen in a book or what you're going to do in a scene, for me, I find I suddenly don't want to write that scene as much. So there's this balance of knowing enough to know where to go in a longer work of fiction next, but not knowing enough that you kind of lose interest in that. So for me, I kind of had a few settings in mind from the outset, and I had these characters I'd been living with for many years, primarily the Ames family, the three brothers, Fallon and Arno. And also I had Adam and Molly way back in like 2009 or 10 when I first started thinking about the book. So I knew I had these characters that were very alive and were staying with me all through grad school at Iowa. It was 2010 to 2012. I was working on stories, but these characters that would become the characters in the Lowering Days were still very much in my imagination. So once I kind of knew who the book was centered around, I started to figure out what would happen in the book based on what they were kind of most interested in, or what issues came up in their lives in a way that took priority. So for instance, like, the activism in the book is activism that is close to Fallon's character. And, the fact that some of the political issues in the novel, that the tensions in fisheries, like those are elements that are both very alive and very real in the family lives of both the Creoles and the Ameses. So kind of taking these political issues and funneling them through character was a large part of my process. And then one thing I do is I walk a lot. Anytime I'm walking or hiking, I like to use that opportunity to kind of inhabit a particular character and just try to imagine or see the world from their standpoint. So I might be walking in the woods with all those dogs one day, very much trying to inhabit the character of Lyman and think about what Lyman would notice or how the world would feel to Lyman. And I take a lot of notes mentally. When I come back and I take those notes down on paper, then I slowly build a scene out. So for me, it's a process of like going really slowly and noticing as much as I can. And then once I think I understand something, whether it's a character or a scene, I try to get a draft down really fast. And I went chapter by chapter with the Lowering Days, kind of constructing the book that way. And then you see there's elements where you need to weave back into another chapter or weave forward into another issue. It starts to kind of emerge like a spider web that's somewhat organic.
That's amazing. So when you're taking these walks, do you bring a notepad, or you just run home?
Yeah, no, I used to bring a notepad and I would always like write down notes, and I still usually have a notepad, but I've kind of just defaulted to taking recorded notes on my phone, or writing down a note on my phone. So for years I did it all by hand, but now I'm doing it more and more via hand and technology. And I find that like sometimes I can get a note or an idea down quicker that way. It's a little less obtrusive than like digging the notebook out and taking my mittens off and finding the pen and all of these things.
Well, we want to hear from your book in a minute, but there is a good question coming in from Jenna from Freeport, so I'll ask this one first. The Lowering Days is the name of Almy's mother's newspaper and this novel. Can you define the term as you see it?
That's a great question. Thank you, Jenna. Kind of an interesting aside, like titles are really hard and I usually struggle with titles, but far before I had much of this book, I talked about some of the things that were in my imagination that predated the novel itself. One of the things that was there was the title. I had The Lowering Days as a title very far back, like in 2010 or 11, when I was just starting to outline this. And in some ways, it became kind of like a beacon I was writing towards. And that worked really well for this particular project. So for me, like what it means is it's a phrase that kind of has three meanings. It's literal interpretation, like Jenna mentioned, is it's the name of the newspaper that Fallon starts. At a figurative level, She tells a story about how her great grandfather had called funerals lowering days. So it's kind of a reference to like the day of death, of the return to the earth. And it's also the day a boat is launched into the water, the lowering day, the birthing day. So what I had was this title that felt very literal and yet figurative in two particular ways. It was about life, or birth or rebirth, and was also about death, kind of beginnings and endings. So for me, it became kind of a circle that just holds all these lives together. And in many ways, that's the structure of the novel. I mean, it's this big kind of circular thing that moves in and out of different people's lives, much like a river kind of courses through the land, getting to where it needs to go. So for me, it's just like, it's this big unifying kind of circle that holds these people and these communities together.
There's a lot in that title.
Yeah.
So let's just take this chance to have you pick a passage to read to us, and then we can talk about that a little bit. Maybe you can tell us the context
Yeah.
is.
So I'm going to read a passage here, starting off. Let's see, actually read first. So I'm going to read from the beginning of chapter 5. It's the start of part 2 in the book, and it's the first time that we meet Adam and Molly. We've heard that the mill's been burned down. We've met the Ames family and the Creel family, and we have an idea of what's happening with the aftermath of the fire. This person is being kind of sought after. We're trying to figure out what's happened here, and was this an act of eco-defense? Was this an act of eco-terrorism? Like, how are the communities going to respond to it? And we meet Adam and Molly. They're in hiding, essentially, and we're going to spend a couple pages with them. The man listened for the dawn birds returning to the trees and added more wood to the fire. The logs were small and snapped in the soft gray light. There was an art to keeping a fire low enough to avoid notice, but warm enough to survive the night. While the bright high sun blistered the days now in April, the temperature often struggled to escape the 40s still, and snow drifted through their campsite. The man pushed up the coals in the fire, where a flat stone was heating. He laid 2 gutted and filleted fish on the stones and listened to the fat sizzle. The campsite was surrounded by thick woods and set in the shadows of Bald Hill. Though they'd put leaves and branches over the tent to better disguise it and packed in bales of straw for insulation, it wasn't a home or a place for staying. Adam Greenwind found it insanely strange that he was sitting over an early spring fire in the deep woods, essentially hugging an old Penobscot migratory route, trying to figure out what to make of his life now. 2 weeks before, he had stepped into the hallway of their little ranch house in the middle of the night and found his 14-year-old daughter, Molly, frantically packing a bag. She was terrified when she looked up at him. Out the hallway window, he could see the silhouette of the birch bark wigwam he and Molly had started building that fall for a tribal project about exploring family heritage. They had raised the sapling frame and sheathed the structure, but they'd been unable to finish before winter. While he'd spent all February and March talking excitedly at breakfast about getting back out to finish the house, Molly's enthusiasm waned. Instead, in the mornings, her eyes continually fell on the unopened stack of bills and delinquency notices piling up on the table. When he moved the stack onto his dresser so she wouldn't have to see it each morning, she'd retrieve the bills and put them right back at the center of the table. That was Molly, not one to let things go unnoticed. He had started getting dressed in his work clothes again as soon as he woke, even though there'd been no work but odd jobs for almost 2 years since the mill closed. It just made her more upset. "You can't fool me into thinking things are okay, Dad," she said. "I leave you behind and go to school. Every day you're just here alone. I hate it." The old grandfather clock working time over in the living room was the only sound in the house. He thought he heard deer or raccoons scurrying around outside under the moon. Then he caught the whine of sirens in the distance and began to really worry. Dawn was 2 hours away, and he understood that light would be no help to whatever was happening here. He grabbed his own duffel bag and began stuffing supplies into it, packing light, but packing smart. Molly stopped. "You can't come. See if you can stop me." She thought she might start crying, but then her face changed, shaking a little, pushing something far down. I messed up. We all do, sweetie. Stop acting easy, Dad. Stop acting cool. It isn't you. Okay, he said. Then tell me what happened. She had been honest with him after that. Now it seemed nothing would ever be the same. I'll stop there.
So tell us a little bit about the significance of that and why you picked that passage.
Yeah. I think that one of the things about that passage that always resonate with me still is just Adam's love for Molly and Adam's kind of panic and utter fear in that moment. When I wrote that scene, or when I wrote the aftermath of the fire, I knew right away that like I wanted to take this and make this about, it's not about the mill or this big act of arson. It's just about the effect on the family. So what I always love is, just the idea of like how far we'll go to support our kids or to support the ones we love, and how in helpless situations, we just can throw in to kind of like support them completely.
Great. And we are getting a lot of good questions on our Maine Public YouTube channel, so keep them coming. I'll try to read as many as I can here. We have a question, John from Buxton says, the detail in this novel is extraordinary. It's like a big red light for fast readers. Is this your style, or did you include so much detail to mimic the pace of life in the world you describe?
Thank you. That's a great compliment. Actually, I like slowly reading things. I like kind of being forced to stop and really take in language. It was conscious in that it's a literary novel, and I always wanted to write a literary novel, and I always wanted to write a novel where language was just kind of like the higher power dictating what I was doing as an artist. That's always been really important to me as a writer. When I was growing up, like I love stories, and my family, like we had storytellers all over. And then, for me, like I was a really shy kid. So it was hard for me to just step up and, contribute stories orally. But what I found was like the power of language in crafting stories. So again and again, I returned to how to make the book kind of sing as much as I possibly could, and how to include as much sensory detail as I could to make the passages and the places that I was trying to write about seem as alive as they deserve to be. But I love that metaphor. Speaking of lyrical writing, that metaphor of a big red light for fast readers.
Well, speaking of metaphors, you use a lot of great symbolism throughout the book. There's the ghost apples and the ravens and the river and everything. And in fact, we have a question here from Martha Cade. She says, tell us about how you came up with the magic tree.
Well, thank you, Martha. The magic tree was one of those moments when I was out walking. Believe it or not, I was over at Five Fields Apple Orchard, which is in South Bridgeton. I lived in Bridgeton for a time, and I think it was the winter of 2016, probably. And I was like deep in the middle of writing this book, kind of in the early stages still of the first section. And I was out, I think I was snowshoeing up through the orchard and just thinking about the Ames family and what kind of defined them. I was writing the passage about the banshee and Screech and all these family myths and stories that they carried, and how those stories kind of unified them. And that led me to start thinking about objects in my own life, that were related to stories, whether that was a painting that had been my aunt's, or a set of china dishes that had been my grandmother's. These things that have like stories and significance to them. So I'm out there, I'm snowshoeing, I'm just kind of lost in my own head. And I look up, and in front of me is a great big apple tree. And, there's about 4 or 5 inches of fresh snow on the ground, on the trees. Everything is really iced over. It's a brutally cold day. It was like 9 degrees. And I noticed that this particular tree, the apples were more red than all the other apple trees around me. They were less shriveled. They were encased in ice, and they seemed kind of like October apples still, not February apples. And the phrase like ghost apples immediately came to my mind. And I realized that a tree is a beautiful thing for a family to kind of hold sacred and build legends around. And that is how the ghost apple tree kind of started very much in the real world, and it became a part of this fictional world. So it kind of gets back to what you were asking about autobiographical fiction, Cindy. Like places or little moments are highly autobiographical, but they come into the book in kind of slightly twisted ways.
Huh. And then as far as the indigenous culture that you kind of bring through the book all the way through, from the legends to just, Molly and Moses and everybody, is this something where you grew up around these cultural beliefs and stories or any of that, or did you have to research a lot of that?
It was a little bit of both. It was more research than lived experience, for sure. I grew up in Belfast, so I grew up in, at the mouth of the river. And my family on one side has stayed like really intact in Waldo County. On the other side has stayed really intact in Penobscot County. So I spent a lot of most of my childhood going up and down the river and experiencing that. And, I knew for this book that I wanted to include Penobscot culture at a really important and kind of intricate level or well kind of woven through level, just because it is the original culture of the area that I grew up in, and where we all live now. So for me, kind of had that awareness throughout my childhood, and trying to figure out how to bring it into the book was another question altogether. I'm aware of the long tradition of non-Indigenous people writing about Indigenous people, and it's often been very, very harmful. So for me to not include Penobscot culture or Penobscot lives or the aliveness and currency of Penobscot culture and life seemed like an act of cultural whitewashing or cultural exclusion. That's another part of the continued history of erasure. So I didn't want to go that route. So I knew I wanted to have Penobscot characters in this novel as well. And it became like finding a way into using those stories in a way that's respectful and accurate. And I was really fortunate to have quite a bit of support from the Penobscot Nation, especially around the language elements of the book. And that made the path into that particular culture being used in the book a lot more easy for me.
I was curious about the language because, as we often hear, they're losing the language, the Penobscot. Not many people still know it. So how were you able to get those pieces into the book?
Yeah, it's funny. It was it's a language that was called an extinct language by linguists not too long ago. That's kind of the academic definition of it. But it's still a language that's actively spoken on the island. It's still taught. It's experiencing, what I think is a strong revival among the younger generation in many ways. So I knew what I wanted to say in Penobscot, but I had no idea how to say it. So again, there was a combination of research and reaching out to experts. It was important for me to bring Penobscot language into the book, again, to kind of highlight this language that's one, beautiful, it's two, very alive still among the culture, and three, that's the original language of what we could now call Maine, in the Penobscot area. So I reached out to several people up in the tribe, and then one linguist at USM, and they're in the acknowledgments of the book. They were all like super accommodating and grateful, or very much invested in helping me get the language right. And it's funny you mentioned the language, Cindy, and it's not something that people hear very often. So if we have time here, I'd actually love to play a short clip from the audiobook. The clip is from Molly's letter. It's about 1.5 minutes long. And what we get to hear is Molly's letter, including the Penobscot elements of the letter, read by a Penobscot speaker, Nicole Altvater, who was one of the people from the nation who helped me with the language. And it's a beautiful language, and hearing it out loud, I think, gives it more power to its presence in the book and what it accomplishes in the book.
Oh, that'd be a treat. You have that queued up
Yeah,
right there.
I've got it all queued up. I mean, it's normally it works great. So well, fingers crossed here, but I have it queued up, and I'd be happy to play it.
Sure.
So just to introduce it, so this is the letter that comes to the Lowering Days that Molly sends You're going to hear two voices. The first voice is David Aaron Baker, who is one of the audiobook narrators. The second voice is Molly's voice. It's narrated by Nicole Altvater, who's a Penobscot speaker.
A week after the fire, a letter arrived in the mail at the lowering days. It was written on a brown paper bag instead of dioxin bleached white paper.
Dear readers, this paper is run by a white lady, but she's a white lady who cares. Her heart is in the right place. She gives us the space to be seen and heard. Liliwani. This paper has also shown it cares about truth for everyone, whether human, white, Penobscot, mountain, tree, river, or air. So this paper gets the truth. Benudaman, Wazelmo, Nazibo, Wazelmo Thog, Ach Nadonabam, Banuapscalia. Is Abajila, Abilabamu, Regaluke, Winila, Benuapscalia. Nada, Abajilakwe, Nij, Nawinchin, Dol, Dinana, Ada, Abajilakwe, Nij, Nalida Hasol, Dinana, Nij Nichkin Ki, Nij, Wanijke Zoltina, Awinuchuk, Nagabanawapskilia. The fire I started was meant for the mill only, not to hurt anyone else. I acted alone. For the mill, this is for the river who you harmed, my people who you poisoned, and all the men and women who had to make themselves into machines to keep you alive. I think it's good you're gone. Some things have to stay dead so others can come back to life. To my people, Nodeldaman, Hachi, Polita Hudaman, the river is us. We are the river. I couldn't listen to your crying anymore.
Well, that was a special treat.
Yeah, can everybody hear it? Could you hear it okay?
Yeah, and we really don't ever get to hear have the chance to hear someone speaking in Penobscot language.
No, I mean, and if you don't, and there's a book that just came out. It's called Still They Remember Me. Anybody out there who's curious about Penobscot language or curious about some of the people who have been integral in the revival of Penobscot language, I highly recommend people check it out. It's called Still They Remember Me, and it's a kind of a modern retelling of Penobscot transformer tales that were first collected by Frank Speck. And what's beautiful about this is, Carol Dana and Margaret Lukens and Connor Quinn and the people who were involved in it, they've taken the tales, updated them for today, so the language was more current, and they're printed in the book in a bilingual format. So you have the English translations and the Penobscot versions right next to them. So it's got a great 40-page introduction all about Penobscot language and some of the details and the particular elements that make it just really fascinating and alive. Like a lot of indigenous languages, it treats things that we sometimes think of as inanimate or as non-sentient, like rivers, rocks, trees, with a ton of agency and animation and life. So it's worth checking out.
Great. And we have some comments and questions from other book club members. Susan Goodwin says, the Native American perspective of this book was interesting and welcomed and understood, well written. And she also says, I loved Molly, strong and articulate. And there's a related comment, Carolyn Newton. I loved the vivid imagery and rich detail in this book. One of my favorite parts was Molly's researching and planting the fire-resistant trees and flowers before the fire. That was one of my favorites too, that image. And did you, that just pop in your head, or did that come from something?
A little bit of both. I knew that, the fire was one of the last pieces of the book that I had actually for a long time. Molly and her father were in hiding, or they were living off the land for other reasons. Adam had lost his job at the mill, and their house had been foreclosed on. And it's experience that I knew what that was like. My mom's house was foreclosed on when I was in college, and I watched her lose it and struggle with that. And I know how that feels to a family. So they were kind of displaced for another reason, not the fire, just losing their house. And then the uproar among the surrounding community was about them taking game and exercising, their right to hunting out of season. And it was much more technical, and it wasn't particularly right in some ways. So the fire came to me, and I knew that the fire was actually the act. That's the act at the center of this kind of moral dilemma. What's the greater sin or the greater crime? Is it the fire itself, or is it the act of like taking from the land and having to harm the land to live? So then it became, what's Molly's intention? There's layers to things. Like you figure out a plot line in a book, and you're like, oh, this is the event, but what's the meaning and what's the impetus behind it? Molly is not one who's just going to burn something down for the sake of destruction. That's not in line with her values. But to make a statement, and to make a statement about rebirth, healing, or renewal, that is in line. So I immediately kind of thought about, what does that look like? What does that mean? And, I'm being a big gardener, both my wife and I are, and knowing a little bit about fire ephemerals and how fire activates plants and has for a long, long time, I immediately started thinking about seeds. And it was kind of clear then to me that part of Molly's action is to plant things that will be kind of aided in their germination by the fire, and see what the world brings back up. So, and when I was writing the book too, I often wanted to take elements that are dark or hard or heavy, and there's a lot of things in this book. It's a violent book, it's an intense book, it's a very sad book in many ways, but I wanted there to be a quality of lightness and hope and renewal through all of these elements as well. And that was how it played out for the fire.
Yeah, that was a terrific image of the growth that happens later. That's great. We have a question from Dee in Sanford. She asks, did you think that Arno and Fallon were a good match?
Oh, a good question. I think that Arno and Fallon felt like a really good match at a particular time in their lives. And I think this is the story of a lot of relationships. And sometimes when I'm writing relationships in fiction, I find this really interesting to explore how you can be a good match with someone at one time, and then either because you evolve or they evolve or life evolves around you, suddenly it's a struggle to continue to be a good match. And one of the things that I think makes them a really good match is that they're both very ambitious. They're both very strong-willed. Fallon wants things the way she wants them, and she wants to accomplish what she wants to accomplish in her life. And Arno does too, to the point that they're both almost a little tyrannical in their relationship. So there's this sweetness and this support and this kind of long abiding love between them. And then there's this continual kind of butting of heads about, honoring individual desires within the framework of a marriage, which relies on us, taking into account, this kind of third being that two people create. So I think they're a good match, but I think they're more importantly maybe an honest match. They always felt like a really true couple to me in that way, that their issues are very present and their issues have consequences.
It's interesting that you say it's the honesty in there that you're trying to get at, because I found myself, you kind of want good guys to be good guys. And so throughout the book, there are characters who do just really frustrating things that hurt others, or they're cruel and they say things that you wish they didn't say, which is honest. But is that difficult to do with your characters, to make them have flaws and make you kind of mad at them?
Yeah, it is difficult to do. But then after you do it, you realize it's like the right thing to do, because it makes them more complex, and none of us are purely good or purely bad. Even like Lyman's one of my favorite characters in the book, and in several ways he's kind of this classic antagonist. In other ways, he's just really like not a bad guy. He doesn't seem like it, at least. He's nurturing of these ravens. He's nurturing and protective of his family. Like he's super supportive of Grace. There's all these things that are kind of redeeming about him, but then he's also like a total jerk in many ways. But yeah, I think what's harder though is when you have to kill them off. Honestly, like that's I knew what was going to happen to these characters fairly early on, and I was writing towards the moment of some of their kind of like ends, and that's hard. It's hard to kind of approach that.
So this is not a spoiler for anybody, because I'm assuming everyone read the book, but you did have in mind then that Arno was going to die.
Yeah, I did, and I hope it's not a spoiler too. And if it is a spoiler, then there's still a lot to be said for finding out the journey of how an event happens in a book. Um, I knew that he was going to die, and I knew it had to be a kind of a combination of something that was done to him, and also his own hubris in ways that was important. And it was figuring out how to have that play out. But I
Okay,
got a
we have
lot of
another.
emails.
Yeah, there's all kinds of questions here for you. So here's a comment from Jim. I'm impressed with how well you captured the sense of spirituality with place and between the families. It seems to me that anyone who grew up close to the land can develop a strong sense of place and depth of spiritual connection with land and its inhabitants. By the way, I grew up on the outskirts of Bangor, so the Penobscot is also my ancestral river. So this idea of place, that seems to be really central to what you do when you write.
Yeah, it is, and it kind of always has been. When I first started writing, I was really preoccupied with place. I mean, I would spend a ton of time getting place right or getting the way a place felt right to me or my characters. So yeah, it's kind of everything in writing for me. And it's a character in itself. It's something that creates an atmosphere or a tone for the book. It dictates story in many ways, and I'm glad to hear that came through for Jim, and I've heard that from a lot of readers, and that's kind of one of the greatest compliments I could receive in this book because approaching it for me, it was kind of in the back of my mind. At least I had this idea of it being a love letter to a particular place, and I hope I
Great.
accomplished.
I think you did. We have a question from Jen C. Was there any path he went down and wrote and then backtracked on? Any example to share?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, at one point, the book was about 75 pages longer than it currently is. There was this whole weird kind of magical realism, almost like a fairy tale or fable that was in it around a person that was made of ravens. And it was an extension of a dream that Lyman had, and it was kind of a section of the novel that was set far in the past, far further up the river, and in a fur trapping outpost. So it was this weird, like historical kind of fairy tale or parable that tied into Lyman's kind of ravens and the image of the ghost apple tree. So that's totally not there, and that will be a part of something else. I think I'm working on something kind of built around that now. Other kind of like false avenues. I mean, there's a lot of them, especially in a novel, which is such a large thing to write, and in a book that I didn't fully outline. It's not really my style. But there was a storyline about Galen being more present in the book, and Galen and the boys kind of coming into a conflict together, and there was a whole element of race Creole pursuing a family that needed help in this whole kind of social work side story that didn't ultimately make it in the book. So there's a few areas that didn't kind of reach the final version, but that's just how it goes. Like for me, I have the manuscript. It's like 86,000 words. I think that was the final book length. And then I have this notes file that's about 200,000 words, and it's all scenes that were cut out that I didn't use, various other notes, ideas, elements, stuff that just kind of didn't make it into the novel.
Okay. We have another question from C. Fass. As I read about Lyman's sabotage of the plane, I thought that perhaps Galen would die in the crash, since Lyman didn't know Galen was learning to fly, and wondered how Lyman would have dealt with that. Was that a consideration when you were writing that part?
Yeah, it was a consideration. And ultimately, I landed on Arno being the only one who died for a couple of reasons. I wanted him to do what he could to kind of save Galen, which he does to a degree. And I also wanted, it's going to sound like really dark, I guess, but I wanted Lyman, in living with the aftermath of this, to live with the feeling of what he almost did to his son, and to be confronted by like that, oh my God, what like moment, like, oh, what have I done? What did I not know about? So if Arno and Galen both died for me, then Lyman's just confronted with like this incredible guilt around killing two people, one of which is his son. If his son lives, it forms a different set of like emotional realities that he has to deal with as a person. And I thought those were more interesting. I also, for a while, played with Galen being more involved after the crash with the aftermath of the book. So he needed to kind of still be alive. In addition to feeling like the right move to have him alive, he needed to be alive for this scene that in section that didn't make it into the final version.
Okay, we have more questions coming in on YouTube, but I do want to check in with you to see if you wanted to read us another passage. I know there was something else that you had picked out.
I'd love to. We've talked a lot about the aliveness of the land and how that's kind of an overarching theme in the book and how much that matters to me in my life. So there's two short passages I'd like to read. And one of them also is the passage about that relates to Molly kind of seeding the mill before the fire. So I'm going to read a short passage from page 88, then I'm going to jump back and read a short passage from page 80. And I think they kind of pair well together thematically. I had always thought that land was land. Water was water, an island was an island. None were human-owned, up for occupying, raiding, or abusing. When the wind tore through the trees, I turned to the sky and tried to map the shapes it wrote into the branches. I put my hand to the damp grass in the morning and lifted it when I no longer felt thirsty. Smells were not just smells, but layers of smells, lovingly built like a painting. Twig on top of leaves, on top of moss, on top of loam, on top of dirt, on top of root, on top of rock, on top of bone, on top of basalt. On the forest floor, I ran through time. Old leaves under new leaves, dry needles at the bases of pines. When I scratched the needles up with the toe of a shoe, gnats would whip through the light, flocking to fresh scent. I slipped pine cones between my lips, pressed my ears to the bellies of ancient cedars, heard blood that I believed in beneath the bark. It was in the aliveness of the world that I knew I was alive. As the rumors spread and our mother's obsession grew, the land around the fire, somewhat stunningly, began to come to life. Willow shoots broke the charred earth around the mill. Fireweed shot up thick and flaming purple. Small families of hickory trees sprouted. Lupin emerged along ashy paths for forklifts and delivery trucks. Other plants came too, rising into the summer. What had for more than 100 years been a lifeless gray industrial landscape turned verdant. As people chased the arsonist and her father looking for answers, for justice, the plants and trees ignored the noise and simply grew. Locals began to notice, then the news people as well. After that, people began coming from all over the state. We needed to see it, visitors said of the mill site. There's something happening here. A couple who came all the way from New Brunswick told my mother during an interview. Don't look away, they said. This is a work of life. Whoever did this had a plan. These people used the word pilgrimage, not knowing what else to call their journeys. We just felt called. Over and over, a similar refrain was repeated in the diners, convenience stores, gas stations, coffee shops, hair salons, barber shops, beaches, river parks, and flea markets around Eastport, as people came to see the land after the fire. My mother had pointed out how rare the act really was. White men blow things up, she said. Penobscot women don't. And she was right. If a Penobscot kid was going to perform an act that perhaps went against everything she'd have ever been taught, there would have to be more to the story. Link and I sat at the newspaper office on a hot day in late June, reading more about willow trees that just happened to clean and remove dioxin, heavy metals, and other toxins from the earth in which they grew. Imagine a tree doing that, I said to Link, healing the ground around it. I'll stop there.
So this kind of leads me to one of the questions from someone sent in, and I think I know the answer, but Julie from Camden asks, you can't not appreciate and see your love of nature and the outdoors in your writing. Is this a passion for you?
Yeah, that's fair to say it is, for sure. Yeah.
You said you're a gardener, so there's part of it right there.
Gardener, walker, just, appreciator of kind of the complexity of the world beyond us.
Terrific. There's also a question. Jim from Portland asks, what feedback have you received from anyone living in the Penobscot Valley region?
I've received a lot of great feedback. People have really loved the book and been supportive of the book, and it's been, for the most part, it's been nothing but generosity from people, and I really appreciate that, because even though this is, I always say it's a Maine of my imagination, because it is kind of fictionalized in some way. At the same time, there are identifiable cultures that are real, places that are real, and like landmarks and geographical areas that are real. So I remember when I kind of wrote this book, that part of when it first came out, I was like, oh God, I hope I don't have a lot of people all through the Penobscot River Valley who are mad because I burned down a mill or something. You're always kind of like, I remember my mom being like, what do you think people in Bucksport will think of you burning down a fictional mill and a fictional version of Bucksport? And a lot of people have been like, yeah, burn it down. It's time for change. And that's part of change. And that's part
It's
of
a
the plan
novel. You can do what you want.
Sure.
Apparently, a few people have this similar question here. Can you speak to the scene near the end when Almi meets the stranger in the woods who gives him the Minotaur card? Was he an angel of death?
Ooh. I don't want to name the stranger for readers too much. I want people to bring their own kind of beliefs about who or what he was to that section. I will say that, that was a really powerful section for me to write, and it emerged kind of surprisingly. I knew that when Almi was going up into that area of New Brunswick, he was going to find something, but I didn't expect it to be this kind of man who acts as a mirror, to kind of reflect his feelings and experiences back to him. So I always love that moment in a book or a work of art when you have the person who emerges unexpectedly and kind of exists a little ambiguously but very concretely in a person's life as well.
For the ending, how did you come up with how you wanted to end the book? Is it hard to figure out how to close everything up?
Yeah, it is hard to figure out how to close something. And I had the ending, or the idea for the ending, when I was probably 2/3 of the way through the book. So I had an idea of it before I got there, which helps. I also knew very early on in the process that I wanted to end the book in East Grand, or at East Grand Lake. So I knew that part, and I just had to figure out how to get there and what would happen there. For a long time, my grandfather, this is my mom's dad, he had a camp, lease camp up on East Grand. And I remember very vividly going up there a couple times from my childhood. He passed away when I was 10, but I went up, like, I think twice. And I had this memory of being out in a canoe with him in the middle of the lake, and kind of, him telling me that this is the line in the water where Canada starts, and the US is on the other side. And I thought that was just so fascinating, that you could be in a place, in a body of water, in two places at once, so to speak. And that got me thinking at that age even about what it meant to be like in two places at once. And if you could be in two places at once, could you actually kind of be anywhere? It's this kind of big physics question that running around through my 12-year-old mind. But I knew I wanted to go back to East Grand, and I wanted to kind of rebuild that place from my childhood that I only vaguely remembered, in a different context.
Precocious kid. We have a question from Mark in Bangor. What were your feelings when you held the printed book for the first time?
Oh, Mark, I was relieved. I was really happy. I was relieved that it happened. It was here. When the book came out, I'd watched so many other authors and friends I knew have their publishing or print dates pushed again and again because of COVID. So I was always, fearful that might happen to the lowering days, and it didn't. And then I was just really grateful. And I was nervous. I was nervous to share it with the world and see how people would experience it or respond to it. For a long time, I spent 7 years writing the book, and for most of that time, I was, it was with me. There were parts I shared with people, but it was largely just kind of me holed up with this thing I was creating. So I was really excited, really relieved, and just nervous.
And so I have to wrap up with the final question. What is next? What are you working on now?
Yeah, good question. I'm working on another novel. It's also set in Maine. So I'm pretty early on in that process, and I just finished revising a linked story collection. So it's a series of short stories that are all interwoven by, maybe not surprisingly, place.
That is no surprise. That seems to be your centering point. Well, what a terrific, wonderful book. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and letting us take a peek into what was going through your head when you wrote this. And we're really glad to hear there's another on the way. Thank you, Gregory Brown, talking about the lowering days. And I just wanted to mention some good news about Maine Public's book club. We are going to continue into 2022. So we're in the process of selecting books from some of the great suggestions we've had from all of you. And I can share with you actually that the next two books are the February-March book club is going to be a conversation between Jennifer Rooks and the author Jessica Anthony about her book, Enter the Aardvark. And I will be back to host the April-May book club, and that is a conversation with Phuc Tran about his memoir, Saigon. So hope that you'll all tune in for those and beyond. We have lots to come. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much to Gregory for talking with us, and we hope you have a good night. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.